If you can't sleep tonight, if life has worn you down with pressures too heavy to carry, if your heart feels empty, cold, and there's no one you can talk to, pause for just a few minutes, not to force yourself to be stronger, not to pretend that the pain isn't real, but to hear a story, a quiet one, one without flashy miracles or loud preaching, but maybe, just maybe, it will reach a quiet corner of your soul. It's the story of someone who once believed they'd been forgotten, who thought God had turned away, but somewhere in the middle of darkness, they found something, not a solution, not instant healing. They found God, not in a crowded church, but in the silence of 3 a.m., in the sound of IV drips, in the whisper of someone praying for them from another room, and in a voice, gentle as the wind brushing through the soul, that said, "I have not left you. I am here." You are invited to enter this story, not to forget your pain, but so you never have to face it alone again. The fluorescent lights in the clinic hallway hummed like a distant static in her ears. Emma sat in the doctor's office, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were fixed on the diploma hanging crookedly on the wall, anything to keep her mind from spiraling. The doctor's voice had been kind, steady, and rehearsed. Words like biopsy, malignancy, and stage 3 floated around the room like ghosts. But the one word that landed, hit her in the chest and refused to leave, was cancer. It wasn't supposed to be her. Not Emma Moore. Not the woman who ran marathons at 40, who meal prepped like clockwork, who hadn't touched a cigarette in her life. She was the one who checked on others, the one who fixed things, the one who always had a plan. She didn't cry. Not on the drive home, not when she walked into her apartment and placed her keys in the dish, not even when she passed by the framed picture of her and her late husband, smiling on their last vacation in Lake Tahoe, before the accident that had turned her into a widow at 38. She only cried when the shower was running, because somehow, behind the sound of falling water, her tears could hide. The next morning, Emma sat on the edge of her bed long before sunrise, her mind numb. She had always thought of herself as strong, independent. She didn't need God. Not really. Maybe once, years ago, she believed. But life had been too cruel, too random. Faith had become a fairy tale she'd filed away with childhood dreams. But that morning, for the first time in years, she whispered, "God, are you still there?" No answer came, just the stillness of the room and the soft ticking of the clock on her nightstand. Over the next few days, everything became mechanical. Appointments, blood tests, MRI scans, cold metal tables, and tight smiles from nurses who had seen far too many Emmas walk through their doors. And the fear, so new at first, was slowly being replaced by something worse: numbness. A gray fog settling over everything, a silence that began to feel permanent. Until one afternoon, while sitting in the waiting room with a pale green wristband digging into her skin, Emma noticed a woman across from her, elderly, frail, clutching a well-worn Bible to her chest. Their eyes met. The woman smiled, soft, serene, unafraid. Emma quickly looked away, but then something strange happened. As the nurse called the woman's name, she stood up, walked past Emma, and placed something gently on the seat beside her. A note, folded, scribbled in pen. Emma hesitated, then opened it. It said, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you." Isaiah 43:2. She didn't know why, but her hands began to shake. That night, she pulled out an old box from her closet. Inside were a few things she hadn't touched in years: her childhood Bible, a cross necklace she wore once at her baptism, and a dried-up pressed flower from her grandmother's funeral. She held the Bible close. She still didn't know what to say. Didn't know if God would answer. Didn't even know if she believed he was real anymore. But she whispered anyway, "Please, I don't want to be alone." And for the first time in weeks, Emma slept through the night. The hospital chapel was always cold. It wasn't large or ornate, just a simple room with a dozen chairs, beige walls, and a small wooden cross mounted on the far wall. In a corner stood a piano that hadn't been tuned in years, and a box of faded hymnals no one seemed to touch. Emma hadn't planned to walk in. She had just finished another round of blood work and found herself wandering without purpose, her steps quiet on the polished floor. The chapel door was ajar. She paused, and then, without fully knowing why, she stepped inside. She sat in the second row, not the front, never the front, but close enough to feel like she was part of something. There was no service, no music, no candles, only silence, and an empty chair beside her. For some reason, that empty chair bothered her. It made her feel more alone, more aware of the stillness pressing in from all sides. She glanced at the wooden cross on the wall. It looked tired, like it had witnessed too many tears and not enough answers. She folded her hands in her lap, unsure what to do. Prayer had always felt like talking to someone who was looking the other way, but still, she tried. "Hi," she whispered, her voice barely audible. She let out a breath and added, "It's been a while." The door creaked behind her. Emma turned and saw an older man enter the chapel, wearing a hospital gown beneath his sweater, IV pole quietly rolling beside him. He didn't look at her. He simply walked to the first row, sat down, and closed his eyes. A long moment passed. Then he began to hum. The melody was slow, familiar, "Amazing Grace," off-key, gentle, worn, but beautiful in its own way. Emma felt something in her chest shift. Not pain exactly, but a pressure. Like something inside her had been waiting to break loose for far too long. The man continued humming, unaware, or perhaps unconcerned, that anyone else was there. When he finished, he opened his eyes, looked over at her, and smiled. "You can cry here," he said softly. "No one will judge you." Emma blinked. "I'm not crying," she said quickly. He nodded. "Not yet." They didn't exchange names. Didn't need to. After a few minutes, he stood and slowly made his way out of the room, leaving Emma once again alone. Except she didn't feel as alone anymore. She looked at the empty chair beside her, still empty, still silent. But for the first time, she imagined someone sitting there. Not just anyone. Someone who had waited patiently, quietly, through her silence and her anger. Someone who didn't leave. That night, Emma wrote in a notebook. Not a journal, really. Just scribbles of thoughts that had nowhere else to go. She wrote, "I still don't understand why this is happening to me. I'm scared. I'm tired. But today, I sat in a cold chapel, and someone hummed a song I hadn't heard in years. And for a moment, I believed you were near." She paused, then added, "If you're still there, please stay." Emma didn't expect anyone to visit. Her diagnosis hadn't been public. She hadn't told many people, only her boss at work, a neighbor who offered to water her plants, and an old friend she hadn't spoken to in nearly 2 years. But 3 days after her chapel moment, there was a knock at her apartment door. She opened it to find a woman holding a paper bag, her coat dusted with rain, eyes both nervous and kind. It took Emma a moment to recognize her. Claire? Claire nodded and gave a hesitant smile. I heard. I wasn't sure if I should come. Emma blinked. Claire had been one of her closest friends during college, but life had drawn them apart. Careers, cities, differing beliefs, and, eventually, silence. They hadn't spoken since Emma's husband died. Now, here she was, on a Thursday, with soup. They sat on the couch with steaming bowls and old memories between them. I didn't know what to say, Claire admitted. Back then, after he passed, I kept thinking I should call, but I didn't know how to talk about God without sounding like a missionary. Emma interrupted with a half smile. Claire laughed, surprised. Exactly. They both grew quiet. Emma looked into her bowl, then said softly, I don't know what I believe anymore. Claire nodded. That's okay. You don't have to know right now. Emma glanced at her. Do you still believe? Claire's answer was immediate. Yes, more than ever. Emma tilted her head, intrigued. Even when nothing makes sense? Especially then. After dinner, Claire handed her a small book. It was worn, with a cracked leather cover. Something that helped me when I was diagnosed, Claire said. Emma's eyes widened. You were sick? Claire nodded slowly. 2 years ago. Breast cancer. Stage 2. I'm in remission now. Emma stared at her, stunned. She hadn't known. I found this at a thrift store while I was going through treatment. It's just prayers. Some of them are angry. Some don't even mention God. But they're honest. And that's all I had in me at the time. Emma turned the first few pages. The ink was smudged in places, water-stained, maybe from tears. After Claire left, Emma sat on her bed, the book in her hands. She opened to a random page and read, Lord, I don't feel you today. I don't see you in the mirror, or in the IV drip, or in the way my hair is falling out. But I'm still talking to you, even if I'm only whispering. Maybe that's what faith is. Not shouting, but showing up. One breath at a time. Emma closed her eyes. She had shown up, hadn't she? To the doctor, to the chapel, to the conversation she never thought she'd have again. Maybe that counted for something. She turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, the book resting on her chest. Somewhere deep in her soul, she whispered without words, I'm still here. I'm still listening. And for the second time that week, she slept. It started with the pillow. Emma woke to find a few strands, no more than a dozen, really, stuck to the fabric like threads, unraveling from something once whole. She sat up, ran her fingers through her hair, and pulled away, with a small handful. Her breath caught. It was expected. The doctors had warned her. She had signed the forms, chosen a treatment plan, watched the informational video. But there is no video that prepares you for watching your own body betray you. She stared at the strands, the absurd lightness of them. Then slowly rose, walked to the bathroom, and turned on the light. In the mirror, she still looked like Emma. But something was different. Not on her scalp, yet, but in her eyes. They were no longer just tired. They were grieving. That afternoon, she went to the salon. I'd like it short, she told the stylist, her voice calm. practiced. How short? The woman asked gently. Emma hesitated, then took a deep breath. All of it. The stylist paused, looked into Emma's eyes, said nothing, just nodded and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. The sound of the clippers buzzed through the room like a swarm of bees, louder than it should have been. Emma closed her eyes as the weight fell away, piece by piece. It wasn't vanity. Not really. It was identity. It was letting go of the woman who once stood in boardrooms, who gave speeches and scheduled her life into neat compartments. It was morning, and something about that was sacred. That night, Emma stood in front of her bathroom mirror, now bareheaded. She expected to cry. Instead, she reached for the small cross necklace she hadn't worn in years. Claire had found it among her old things and left it quietly on her dresser. Emma held it now, fingers wrapped around the cool metal. In the quiet of the bathroom, she whispered, I don't feel beautiful. I don't feel strong. But I want to feel something. She let the cross fall gently against her chest and took a deep breath. Later, she sat at her kitchen table, journal open. She didn't write much, just a sentence. I don't know if I'm healing, but I know I haven't stopped hoping. She looked at the words. They weren't poetic, but they were honest. And lately, honesty was the closest she'd come to prayer. Emma never thought she'd return to the hospital chapel, but 3 days into her second round of chemotherapy, when her body felt like it had forgotten how to be a body, when even breathing felt like a negotiation, she found herself again in the little beige room with the tired cross. This time, she didn't sit in the second row. She walked to the very back, slid into a seat near the corner, and rested her head in her hands. She wasn't there to pray. Not really. She was just there. Sometimes, being in a place where others had prayed, where others had whispered to a God she still wasn't sure she believed in, was enough. She closed her eyes. The air was still. No hum of electricity, no coughs or footsteps, just the faint sound of her own breathing and the rise and fall of her chest. And then she heard it, a voice, not loud, not theatrical. A woman's voice, low, even, steady, coming from somewhere near the front. Emma hadn't noticed anyone else when she walked in, but now she heard her clearly. The woman wasn't reading scripture. She was just talking, softly, as if God were sitting beside her, invisible and patient. Thank you for today, even if it was hard, the woman said. Thank you for my nurse, Maria, for the way she joked about her cat to make me laugh. Thank you for the phone call from my sister, and thank you for not leaving. Emma sat very still. Something about the simplicity of those words pierced through the fog in her chest. This wasn't a performance. This wasn't theology. This was a conversation. The voice continued, I'm scared, God. But you already know that. I miss having hair. I miss dancing in my kitchen. I miss my old life. But even if it never comes back, I know you'll sit with me here. Even in this. Silence. Emma felt the sting of tears behind her eyes, not because the prayer was profound, but because it was real. It gave permission. Permission to be human, to be undone, to be unsure, and still speak. The voice grew quiet. Emma considered slipping out unnoticed, but something inside her held her there. She sat for a long time in the quiet, the echo of the woman's words still hanging in the air. Eventually, she stood and walked slowly toward the door. She paused before leaving, looked back once at the cross, still tired, still weathered. But now, it looked familiar. That evening, Emma opened her journal again. I heard someone talk to you today like you were real. not distant, not holy in a way I can't reach. Just here, sitting in a wooden chair, listening to her fears without needing her to fix them first. I want that. I want you like that. She closed the book, and for the first time, she whispered aloud, God, you can sit with me too, if you want. The oncology wing waiting room was a strange place. No one wanted to be there. And yet, for those who returned week after week, a quiet sort of fellowship formed. Not in words, usually. In glances, nods. The silent understanding between people who all carried invisible weights. Emma sat in her usual chair, back straight, hands folded in her lap. She was getting used to the rhythm now. Check-in, blood pressure, small talk with nurses, the slow drip of chemotherapy. But today felt heavier, not because of pain, but because the nurse had slipped the word progression into a sentence she hadn't finished. Emma didn't ask what she meant. She wasn't sure she wanted to know. Across the room, a boy sat with a knit cap pulled low over his forehead. He couldn't have been older than 11. His legs dangled off the chair. He held a plastic dinosaur in one hand and a juice box in the other. Beside him sat a man. His father, maybe. Silent, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. The boy looked up, caught Emma's gaze, and gave a small, crooked smile. She smiled back. After a few minutes, the boy stood and shuffled over to the donation bookshelf in the corner. He scanned the titles, most of them old magazines, self-help paperbacks, and devotionals. He picked one up, bright yellow, a children's Bible. He walked over and held it out to Emma. This is a good one, he said. Emma blinked. Have you read it? The boy nodded. Lots of times. My grandma reads it to me when I'm getting chemo. My favorite part is the one where Jesus takes a nap on a boat during a storm. Emma raised her eyebrows. That's your favorite? Yeah. 'Cause everyone was freaking out, and he was just sleeping, like he wasn't scared at all. That means he knew they'd be okay, even if the storm was big. She stared at him, unsure how to respond, then finally whispered, That's actually kind of amazing. He smiled again and returned to his seat. Emma opened the children's Bible and flipped through the pages. Colorful illustrations, simple words, gentle truths. She found the story the boy had mentioned. Jesus was in the boat, sleeping. A storm rose up. The waves were big. The boat rocked. The disciples were afraid. But Jesus said, Peace, be still. And the storm stopped. She touched the page. Something in her chest softened. She didn't know how long she sat there with the book in her lap. Eventually, a nurse called her name. Emma rose and followed, the boy's quiet courage still echoing in her thoughts. That night, she wrote, a little boy reminded me that storms don't scare you. That even if I'm afraid, you might be resting. Not because you don't care, but because you know I'll get through this. I want to believe that, even if the waves keep coming. It was raining again. Emma had begun to appreciate the sound of rain, its rhythm, its softness, the way it filled silence without asking anything in return. That afternoon, the sky had darkened early, casting gray light through the hospital windows as she made her way back to the chapel. Something about that room kept drawing her in. It wasn't just about faith. It was about stillness and the quiet sense that if she stayed there long enough, something inside her might slowly be mended. Today, she noticed something different. The piano, always tucked in the corner, always closed and untouched, was open. Not just open. Someone was sitting at it. It was the same older man she had seen weeks before, the one who had hummed Amazing Grace. His fingers hovered above the keys with reverence, not confidence. He wasn't playing for performance. He was playing because something inside him needed to. The melody drifted through the chapel like a prayer without words. It wasn't perfect. The keys were slightly out of tune, and the player stumbled now and then. But the sound was sincere, familiar. Emma stood at the entrance, unmoving. Then slowly, she stepped in and took a seat in the second row, the same place she had sat the first time she came. She listened. He played slowly, haltingly, a mixture of hymns and simple songs, nothing complicated. But one melody stood out. It is well with my soul. The old hymn poured gently from the dusty keys, and something in Emma's chest broke open. When the music stopped, the man turned slightly. He saw her, smiled, nodded once. Emma rose and walked to the piano, slowly. I didn't know anyone played that, she said. He chuckled softly. I didn't either. Not for a long time. Why now? He looked at the keys. Because I remembered that I still could. Emma sat on the bench beside him, keeping a respectful space between them. I used to play too, she said, when I was a teenager, before life got complicated. Play, he said simply, scooting aside. Emma hesitated. She hadn't touched a piano in over 15 years. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She pressed one, then another, a simple progression, a chord, a fragile beginning, and then slowly a melody emerged, not polished, not ready for a stage, but steady, honest. As her hands moved, tears began to fall, quietly, without shame. The notes became a kind of confession. She was scared, tired, angry. But in that moment, with each trembling note, she was also something else, not alone. They played together for a while, taking turns, sometimes overlapping, sometimes silent. When they finished, the man said nothing. He just stood, patted her shoulder, and left. Emma sat in the empty chapel long after, her fingers still resting on the keys. That night, she didn't journal. She didn't need to. She had already said everything she needed through music. The next morning, Emma returned to the small yellow children's Bible the boy had handed her. It was still on her nightstand, right where she'd left it, worn, soft-edged, and oddly comforting. She opened it, not for a lesson or sermon, but for presence, for something to hold that didn't beep, scan, or tell her how long she had left. She flipped to the Gospel of John. Her fingers stopped on a page marked with a torn piece of envelope. At first, she thought it was just a bookmark, but when she pulled it free, she saw writing. Small, careful handwriting on the back. It was a letter. It read, "Dear friend, if you found this, maybe it means you're hurting like I once did. Maybe you're tired, scared, and wondering if God still sees you. I don't know your name, and you don't know mine. But I want you to know you are not invisible. I left this note here when I finished my last chemo session. I rang the bell, smiled for the camera, and then went home and cried for hours. Because even when the treatment ends, the fear doesn't. But I'm still here. 2 years later, still standing, still uncertain, but with peace I didn't earn and couldn't explain. And that peace, it came when I stopped demanding answers from God and just started sitting with Him, crying with Him, yelling sometimes, and He stayed. He didn't run. He didn't fix everything overnight. But he stayed, and he'll stay with you too. Even if you're not ready to believe that yet, you're not alone. Even now, love someone who's been there. Emma read it twice, then a third time. By the fourth, her hands were shaking. It wasn't the eloquence. It wasn't theology. It was the simple, startling truth. Someone had felt what she felt, sat where she sat, questioned the same questions, and still they had found peace, not by escaping the valley, but by walking through it and discovering they weren't alone there. She folded the letter gently, tucked it back where it was, and whispered, "Thank you, whoever you are." She held the Bible to her chest and closed her eyes. That night, Emma wrote, "I didn't meet her, but she knew me. Her words found me exactly where I am, in the dark, in the fear. And maybe that's how you work too. Not through lightning or thunder, but through someone else's ink-stained envelope, through silence that's been filled before, through stories that don't end in miracles, but in someone staying." There were good days now, not perfect days, but quiet ones. Days when Emma could sit in the sunlight with a cup of tea and forget, for a few moments, that she was sick. Days when her laughter didn't sound foreign, when food had taste, when sleep came without tears. But no one tells you how grief comes back, even while you're still healing. It started with a phone call, a routine scan, a routine follow-up. But this time, the doctor didn't say, "Things are stable." This time, he said, "We've seen something, a shadow, small, unclear, maybe nothing, but also maybe something." And just like that, the storm returned. Emma didn't cry at first. She sat on her couch with the phone still in her hand and stared at the window, the sun glowing warm on the floor, as if nothing had changed, except everything had. The quiet peace she'd built, like a fragile nest of twigs and prayers, suddenly felt too delicate to hold her fear. That night, she didn't journal. She didn't pray. She turned off the lights and lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, arms crossed over her chest like a shield. She felt angry, not weeping angry, empty, angry, like she'd been tricked. Wasn't she doing the right things? Hadn't she softened, believed, reached out? Why would God let hope rise just to knock it over again? Sometime past midnight, she finally whispered into the darkness, "I don't want to do this again." No reply. Not even the sense of presence she had begun to rely on. Only silence. For the first time in weeks, she felt completely alone again. But then, a memory. The little boy in the waiting room. Jesus wasn't scared of the storm. Emma let out a slow breath. It wasn't comfort exactly, but it was something small, like a candle in the farthest part of her mind. She turned onto her side, tucked the blanket beneath her chin, whispered, softer this time, "Even if you're sleeping, just stay in the boat." In the morning, she sat at the kitchen table with her journal and wrote, "The shadow on the scan is real, but so is the boy's smile. So is the song in the chapel. So is the letter in the Bible. Maybe the storm came back, but this time, I know I'm not facing it the same way." She closed the notebook, made tea, opened the blinds, let the morning in. The infusion room was quiet that morning. No one spoke much anymore, not in the later rounds of treatment. The novelty had worn off, the optimism had faded, and the patients sat in recliners with blankets over their knees, watching IV bags drip like slow clocks. Emma had claimed her usual chair near the window. The nurses greeted her kindly. By now, they all knew her name and how she liked her tea. But she didn't smile much today. The storm of "we saw something" still lingered in the corners of her mind like a low, distant thunder. She pulled her hat lower, leaned back, and tried to breathe through the weariness in her bones. Then she noticed the woman across from her. She was older, 60, maybe 70, with skin like soft leather and eyes that seemed to hold decades of both sorrow and humor. She wore a vivid blue scarf tied neatly around her bald head and a necklace with a small, worn wooden cross. Emma tried not to stare, but the woman looked up and caught her gaze. She smiled. "First time seeing a walking miracle," the woman asked playfully. Emma blinked. "Excuse me?" The woman laughed, not unkindly. "Stage 4. That was 5 years ago. Doctor said it was time to get my house in order." She leaned forward. "I told them, my house is fine. You should see my soul now." Emma found herself smiling for the first time that day. They started talking. Her name was Rose. She had 4 grown children, 7 grandchildren, and an old cat named Franklin who ruled the house. But the real story, she said, wasn't her remission. It was what God did after the diagnosis, Rose said. "I used to be in control of everything: lists, calendars, church volunteer boards. But when my body gave up, my spirit finally got quiet enough to listen." "To what?" Emma asked softly. Rose pointed upward. "Not a voice," she said. "Not at first. More like a presence. Like someone sitting next to you in the dark. No answers. Just there." Emma swallowed hard. "I felt that," she whispered. "I know," Rose replied. "I can see it in your eyes." When the session ended, Rose reached into her bag and pulled out a small white envelope. "I don't give this to everyone," she said, "but I think you're supposed to have it." Emma hesitated, then took it. Inside was a simple card, handwritten. It read, "Faith is not the absence of fear. It's choosing to stand anyway, even if your knees are shaking." There was no name on the card, only a single line at the bottom: "You're not alone. Ever." That night, Emma stood in her bathroom, hat removed, staring at the reflection of a woman both familiar and foreign. She opened her hand and looked at the card again. Then she whispered the words aloud, "Not alone." And for the first time in weeks, she believed it. Not completely, not loudly, but enough. Emma hadn't stepped inside a church in over a decade. Even when she had believed in God, she'd always preferred solitude to pews. Organized religion had often felt like too much noise, too many rules, too many people pretending not to be afraid. But on that particular Sunday, something nudged her. Not a voice, not guilt, just a quiet pull, like a door in her soul slowly creaking open. She didn't go to a large cathedral or a glowing sanctuary. She found a small chapel tucked between 2 brick buildings, with a crooked sign and a bell tower that hadn't rung in years. She stood at the doorway for a long moment, her fingers brushing the hem of her sleeve. Then she stepped inside. It was warmer than she expected. No stained glass, no projection screens, just wooden benches, candles flickering on a side table, and the faint sound of an old woman playing a hymn on the piano. There were no greeters, no program, no sermon that day. Only a handful of people scattered across the room, sitting in silence. It was perfect. Emma took a seat near the back. She didn't bow her head. She didn't fold her hands. She just breathed, and as she sat there, a strange realization crept over her. She wasn't there to ask for healing. Not this time. She was there to say thank you. Thank you for the little boy with the dinosaur and the Bible. Thank you for Claire and soup an unspoken forgiveness. Thank you for Rose and her scarf and the words that shook something loose inside her. Thank you for the storm, because without it, she wouldn't have known she needed the boat. Tears came, not from pain, but from release, from the weight that had lifted, not because it disappeared, but because it was now shared. She whispered, barely audible, I'm still sick. I'm still scared. But I'm also still here. Before leaving, she lit one of the candles. There was a small book nearby where visitors could write prayers or names. Emma took the pen, paused, then wrote, for everyone who feels forgotten in the storm. Let them feel you sitting beside them. She closed the book gently, walked back out into the sunlight, and smiled, not because the road ahead was easy, but because she knew, finally, she wouldn't walk it alone. The first time Emma saw the scar, really saw it, she was standing in front of the mirror with the hospital gown loosely tied behind her. The fluorescent light cast everything in sharp, unflattering honesty. It ran just below her collarbone, faintly pink, still healing. A reminder. A line between the life before and the life after. She stared at it, unmoving, not out of shame, not quite out of fear either, but recognition. Scars had never bothered her on others. She'd once called them stories the skin remembered, but this one was hers. And it said things she wasn't ready to put into words. It said, you've been hurt. It said, you survived. But also, it whispered, you'll never be the same. Later that day, Emma met Claire for coffee. They sat outside, even though the air was brisk. Emma wore a scarf that covered the mark, but as the wind picked up, it loosened and slipped down slightly. Claire saw, and she said nothing, not out of avoidance, but in respect, in knowing. After a while, Claire reached across the table and placed something in Emma's hand. A small, square mirror, its edges soft with age. Emma raised an eyebrow. Why this? Claire smiled. Because I want you to see what I see. Emma turned it over, looked. She still saw tired eyes, pale skin, a head covered now only by a soft cap. But she also saw clarity, not the kind that glows or shines, but the kind forged slowly, through fire, through waiting, through surrender. And the scar? It wasn't ugly. It was honest. That night, Emma stood again in front of her mirror at home. She took off the scarf. For the first time, she let the scar show. Then she whispered, God, you let this happen. And maybe you could have stopped it, but you didn't. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. And I think I still trust you. She touched the scar gently. I'm not what I was before, but maybe that's okay. Maybe that's grace. In her journal, she wrote, scars don't mean I lost. They mean I lived. I don't need you to erase the wound, God. Just sit with me while it heals. She hadn't returned to the hospital chapel in a while, not because she no longer needed it, but because she had quietly begun to carry it with her, like a memory folded into her coat pocket. But today, something called her back. Maybe it was the quiet ache in her chest after the most recent scan. Maybe it was the nurse's soft eyes when she said, we'll wait and see. Maybe it was simply that Emma needed a place where she didn't have to hold herself together. She opened the chapel door slowly. It looked the same. The wooden benches, the flickering candles, the worn-out cross on the wall that had watched 1,000 kinds of grief, and the piano, still dusty, still quiet. But this time, it wasn't the music that drew her in. It was the empty chair, the same one beside where she used to sit. the one she had always imagined someone invisible occupying. God, memory, hope. She walked over and sat down in the same second row spot. The chair beside her still empty, but it didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't a void, it was presence. She didn't speak, not for a long while. She simply closed her eyes, placed her hand on the empty chair, and breathed. And she felt it again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but like the whisper of a page turning. That strange, impossible nearness, the one she had once doubted existed, now sitting quietly beside her. Not to take the pain away, but to say, I know, and that was enough. She opened her journal later that night and wrote just 2 sentences. The chair is still empty, but I'm not. The follow-up scan came back inconclusive. Not good news, not bad news, just more waiting. Emma hung up the phone and sat in silence. She didn't cry this time. She didn't panic. She simply breathed. In, out, in again. It surprised her, this strange calm. Not because she wasn't still afraid. She was. But because fear no longer had the final word. She spent that afternoon on a park bench near her apartment. It was a rare sunny day. Children played. A dog barked somewhere nearby. The air smelled like grass and warmth, and Emma just sat there, soaking it in. She wasn't thinking about white blood cells, or scans, or endings. She was simply living. For the first time in a long while, she realized she didn't have to wait for healing to begin breathing again. She didn't have to be certain to have peace. A woman passed by with a baby in a stroller. The baby locked eyes with Emma, smiled wide, and waved a tiny hand. Emma waved back, surprised by the sting of tears that rose, not from sorrow, but from how beautiful the ordinary had become. When she got home, she opened her journal and wrote, I used to think faith meant certainty, that if I really trusted you, I wouldn't be afraid. But maybe faith is just taking the next breath, even when I don't know what comes after. And maybe trusting you means believing you're in that breath too. She paused. Then, smiling gently to herself, she added, Today, I didn't pray with words. I just sat in the sun, and you sat with me. Emma found it while cleaning out an old drawer. A half-written letter, folded between hospital bills and appointment cards. She didn't recognize the handwriting at first. Then she realized it was hers, from months ago. Maybe the week after her second round of chemo, when everything had felt raw and uncertain. She opened it slowly. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear. Dear God, I don't know if you're real. And if you are, I don't know if you care about me. I'm tired of pretending I'm strong. I'm angry I have to be brave. I want to scream, but I don't even have the energy to cry. If you're listening, say something. Do something. Or at least, just don't leave. She had never mailed it. Not that there was an address. She'd written it, folded it, and forgotten. But now, holding it in her hands, Emma felt something strange. She didn't need to send it anymore, because somehow, somewhere between the pain and the piano, the empty chapel and the blue-scarfed woman, God had answered, not with lightning, not with miracles, but with presence, with people, with whispers, with breath. She put the letter in her journal, not to send, but to remember, to honor the version of herself who had once felt abandoned, and to gently say, You made it this far. That night, she lit a candle. No reason, no ritual, just gratitude. She stood at the window, watching the small flame flicker, and whispered, You stayed. A pause. So I will too. It didn't come in a single moment. There was no dramatic call from the doctor, no parade of nurses with smiling faces, no loud declaration. You're cured. Healing for Emma was slower, quieter. It looked like waking up one morning and realizing she hadn't thought about cancer for a whole hour. It looked like laughing at a dumb commercial and not feeling guilty for being happy. It looked like standing in the grocery store aisle, holding a box of cereal and realizing she was no longer waiting to die, but thinking about what kind of milk to buy. Her body still bore the marks, the scar near her collarbone, the thinness of her hair, now growing in soft and curly, the tremor in her hand when she carried something too heavy. But her soul felt different now, less polished, less sure, but also more rooted, like a tree that had stood through winter, bark cracked and branches bare, yet somehow, impossibly, had begun to bloom again. One morning, Emma visited the park bench where she had once sat watching children play. The same baby, now a toddler, wobbled past her, chasing a pigeon with the focused joy only toddlers have. His mother smiled at Emma. Spring comes early this year, she said. Emma looked at the trees. Buds were forming. Life was coming back, not suddenly, but steadily. That night, Emma lit a candle again. She opened her journal and wrote, I thought healing would mean being who I was before, but now I know. Healing is becoming someone new, not untouched, not unscarred, but whole. And held, she closed the book and whispered into the soft dark, Thank you for not fixing me quickly, but for staying while I changed. Claire had invited her to dinner. Nothing fancy, just soup, bread, soft music, and the kind of quiet only two old friends can share without awkwardness. Emma hadn't gone out in a while, not like this, not without a headscarf, not without carefully thinking through how much energy she'd have left for conversation. But something inside her said, Go. Not because she had to, but because she could. Claire's home smelled like rosemary and lemon. A candle flickered gently on the table. The window was open just enough to let the early spring air drift in. You look good, Claire said, handing her a cup of warm tea. I look different, Emma replied. Claire smiled. Maybe, but you've never looked more yourself. They sat and talked about small things. Books, a neighbor's cat, a silly show they used to watch in college. No one brought up test results. No one tiptoed around fear. And then, somewhere between soup and laughter, Claire paused and asked, Do you think you'll ever go back? To work, I mean. Emma stirred her tea slowly. I don't know, she said. Some days I feel like I could walk right back into that office. Other days, I wonder if I was ever meant to stay in that life. Claire nodded gently. You're allowed to become someone new, you know. That evening, Emma lingered at the table long after the dishes were cleared. There was something sacred about sitting in that space. No IVs, no fluorescent lights, no questions about survival. Just two friends, two chairs, and the quiet, holy act of sharing a meal. She thought about the Gospels, about how many times Jesus simply sat at a table. No sermons, no miracles, just bread, wine, and presence. Maybe healing, she thought, isn't always found in the hospital. Maybe sometimes it's found in a kitchen. Later that night, Emma journaled. There's something holy about a shared meal, about sitting at a table without explaining yourself. Jesus didn't always fix the people he ate with. Sometimes he just loved them while they chewed. Maybe that's enough. Maybe that's grace. It wasn't a special day. No birthdays. No anniversaries, no test results. Just a Tuesday. Emma woke up to sunlight streaming across her bed sheets. The warmth felt soft, almost playful, and for once, she didn't immediately brace herself for fatigue or nausea. She made coffee. She watered the plant in the windowsill, the one that had been near dead for weeks, but had, against all odds, sprouted a new green shoot. She smiled at it. Something about that small act, green where there once was brown, felt like a sermon. Later, she went for a walk. No headphones, no destination, just feet on pavement, wind in her scarf, the sound of birds gossiping in the trees. She passed a flower shop and stopped without meaning to. Inside, the shopkeeper was humming as she arranged sunflowers in a wide glass vase. Emma bought a single daisy, not because she needed one, but because she could. It wasn't until she returned home, placing the daisy in a small jar on the kitchen table, that it struck her. She hadn't thought about death all day. Not once. Not even in the background. Not even subconsciously. It had been a day of life, of living, of choosing joy without explanation. And for Emma, that felt like a resurrection. She sat at the table, watching the daisy lean gently toward the light, then picked up her journal and wrote, "Today I didn't fight for peace. I didn't claw toward gratitude. I just lived." Maybe that's the miracle. Not that the sickness is gone, but that I've stopped letting it steal every moment that isn't. She closed her eyes, let the sunlight warm her skin, and whispered with a smile, "Thank you, God, for this ordinary, beautiful Tuesday." For a long time, Emma had asked one question more than any other. Why me? It wasn't always out loud. Sometimes it lingered behind her thoughts, behind every appointment, behind every ache. A quiet accusation, a cry for justice, a desperate need to make sense of what had been taken. She had tried to answer it in 100 ways. Maybe it was random. Maybe it was genetic. Maybe it was punishment. Maybe it was divine. Each answer left her emptier. But now, as she sat one evening, watching the sky blush into evening over her apartment building, Emma realized something startling. She hadn't asked that question in weeks, not because she had found an answer, but because it no longer mattered the same way. She had learned to ask different questions. Not why me, but who am I becoming because of this? Not what did I lose, but what have I found? Not why did God let this happen, but where has He been in it with me? And somehow, those questions didn't hollow her out. They built something in her, a quiet place inside, wide enough to hold mystery, grief, joy, and hope all at once. She reached for her journal and wrote slowly, carefully. I used to want answers. Now I want presence. I used to demand explanation. Now I crave companionship. And maybe that's how healing changes us, not by giving us what we ask for, but by helping us ask better questions. The sky darkened. Streetlights flickered on. Emma sat still in the fading light, and for the first time since her diagnosis, she said aloud, "I'm glad I'm still here." Not out of triumph, but out of truth, out of grace. Spring had fully arrived now. The park near Emma's home was bursting with color. Tulips in loud reds and yellows, the smell of earth and new beginnings in the air. Children shrieked with laughter in the distance. A couple walked past holding hands. A dog barked joyfully at a butterfly. Emma sat on the same bench she had visited months ago, back when she wasn't sure she'd see another spring. Now she breathed it in slowly, deeply. The air, the moment, the life she hadn't expected to keep. Her most recent scan had come back clear, but strangely, that wasn't the moment she felt healed. It was this one. right now, sitting under a tree, feeling the wind in her real hair, short and messy and full of stubborn life. The healing hadn't arrived with the doctor's call. It had come in pieces, in silence, in music, in friendship, in a chapel, in a scar, and in 100 unseen ways that stitched her heart back together. She opened her journal, its last page waiting. She had carried this journal through fear, through anger, through surrender. It had held her darkest prayers and most tender revelations. Now, there was just enough room for a few final words. She wrote, "I am not the same woman who began this journal. I've been broken and rebuilt and blessed, though not always in ways I understood at the time. I've learned that God does not always speak in miracles, but often in moments, in a child's smile, in a hymn sung slightly out of tune, in an old woman's laugh, and most of all, in the silence where I thought I'd been abandoned, only to realize He had been sitting with me all along. Thank you, God, for not answering every question. Thank you for not rushing the healing. Thank you for staying." She closed the book, watched as a breeze lifted a small daisy from the grass and carried it gently into her lap. She smiled, then stood, walked home slowly, and left the bench behind, not as a place of sorrow, but as a witness to her survival, to her transformation, to her story. Not the end, just the beginning of life after healing.